Good evening, fellow insomniacs and curiosity seekers. Tonight we're settling in for something a little different. 10 quiet encounters with the universe's most persistent public relations team. You know them as the Men in Black, though they'd probably prefer you didn't know them at all. These aren't your Hollywood action heroes with flashy gadgets and alien fighting credentials. No, these are the bureaucrats of the bizarre, the middle managers of mystery. They show up after you've seen something you weren't supposed to see, armed with nothing more intimidating than perfectly pressed suits and an unsettling ability to make problems disappear, including your memory of having those problems in the first place. So, dim your lights, silence your phone, and prepare to drift through 10 gentle tales of ordinary people having extraordinary encounters with the universe's cleanup crew. Each story unfolds in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, where the impossible feels perfectly reasonable and the mundane becomes mysteriously significant. We'll visit soybean fields under starlight, abandoned observatories, and late-night rest stops where time moves differently. We'll meet witnesses who tried to document the undocumentable, only to discover that some experiences prefer to remain anonymous. Let your breathing slow as we begin our first tale, because tonight we're exploring what happens when the extraordinary tries very hard to remain ordinary. Story 1. Soybean lights. The thing about driving through rural Illinois at midnight is that you're guaranteed two things. Absolutely nothing interesting will happen, and you'll have plenty of time to think about it. Sarah Chen had been making this drive from campus to her parents' house for 3 years now, and the highlight was usually deciding whether the gas station coffee was worth the risk of staying awake until sunrise. Tonight was different, though she wouldn't realize just how different until much later, and then she'd spend weeks trying to remember why she thought it was different at all. The AM radio crackled with late-night talk shows and distant weather reports as she navigated the familiar stretch of Highway 9. Corn and soybean fields stretched endlessly on both sides, their neat rows disappearing into darkness like the universe's most boring meditation exercise. The air smelled of dew and fertilizer, that particular Midwestern perfume that city folks find charming for exactly 5 minutes. Sarah was a graduate student in atmospheric physics, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly involves staring at computer models of air currents and wondering if you should have gone to law school instead. She approached the world with scientific skepticism, which made what happened next particularly inconvenient. At exactly 12:17 a.m., she remembered this detail with unusual precision, 9 lights appeared above the soybean field to her right. Not dramatic, blazing UFO lights, but 9 dull white spheres that looked like someone had scattered LED tea lights across the darkness. They moved in a perfect arc, maybe 50 feet above the crops, skimming along in absolute silence. Sarah's first thought was drones. Her second thought was that drones didn't move like liquid mercury, flowing in formation without any visible coordination. Her third thought was that she should probably pull over and document this, because her thesis advisor was always complaining that atmospheric physics lacked compelling visual evidence. She fumbled for her phone, naturally dropping it between the passenger seat and the center console, because technology always chooses the most inconvenient moment to become uncooperative. By the time she retrieved it and activated the camera, the lights were still there, still moving in that hypnotic arc pattern. The phone's camera, however, had apparently decided to stage its own small rebellion. The autofocus hunted desperately, as if it couldn't decide what it was looking at. When Sarah finally managed to capture what she thought were still images, they came out as streaked blurs of light. More frustrating still, the timestamp on every photo read EO0.03, which was impossible unless her phone had developed its own creative relationship with time. She tried recording video, but the display showed only darkness, punctuated by those mysterious streaks. Meanwhile, outside her window, 9 perfectly clear spheres continued their silent dance above the soybeans, as if they were deliberately avoiding documentation. Which, come to think of it, was exactly the sort of thing that would happen to someone whose career depended on documenting atmospheric phenomena. The lights completed their arc and simply weren't there anymore. Not fading, not flying away, just absent, as if someone had turned off a switch. Sarah sat in her idling car, staring at the now empty field, wondering if she'd just witnessed something extraordinary, or if graduate school stress had finally pushed her over the edge into hallucination territory. She decided to drive to the next town and grab coffee, partly to clear her head and partly because she needed to process what she'd seen. The 24-hour gas station sat under harsh, fluorescent lights that made everything look like a crime scene, which, given the quality of the coffee, wasn't entirely inaccurate. That's when she noticed them. Two men stood near the station's front door, which was odd because the station was closed. The automated pumps were still running, but the convenience store was dark. These men weren't trying to get in. They were just standing there, waiting. They wore identical black suits that looked expensive and perfectly pressed, despite the humid night air that had left Sarah's t-shirt clinging uncomfortably. Their movements were synchronized in a way that wasn't quite natural. When one shifted his weight, the other did too, like a perfectly calibrated dance. As Sarah pulled up to a pump, one of the men approached her window. He was pale, unremarkably handsome, and smiled with the sort of professional courtesy you'd expect from a bank manager who was about to foreclose on your house. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "We're looking for Meridian Street. Do you know how to get there?" Sarah had lived in this area her entire life. She'd driven through this town hundreds of times. There was no Meridian Street. Not here. Not in any of the surrounding towns. She was about to explain this when something in the man's eyes suggested that correcting him might not be wise. "I'm sorry," she said instead. "I'm not familiar with that street." "That's perfectly fine," he replied, still smiling. "The sky is safer when it's empty." It was such an odd thing to say that Sarah found herself nodding, as if it made perfect sense. Only later would she realize how strange the comment was, and by then she'd have much larger problems to worry about. The man returned to his companion, and they walked around the building, moving with that same unsettling synchronization. Sarah pumped her gas quickly, suddenly eager to leave. When she went to pay, she discovered that her credit card receipt had printed completely blank, just a white slip of paper with no text, no numbers, no indication that any transaction had occurred. She drove home through the pre-dawn darkness, trying to make sense of what she'd experienced. The lights, the strange men, the broken technology. It felt like pieces of a puzzle that weren't quite fitting together. Over the next week, she found herself driving past that soybean field every night, hoping to see the lights again. She never did, but she did notice something else. Every night, a black sedan was parked by the grain silos at the edge of the field. Not running exactly. She could see the heat shimmer from the engine, but no driver was ever visible inside. The car was always gone by morning, leaving behind only the faint smell of ozone and the peculiar sensation that she was forgetting something important. If you're finding these quiet encounters as intriguingly unsettling as Sarah did, you might want to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got 9 more tales ahead, each stranger than the last, and honestly, you'll probably sleep better knowing you won't miss them. Plus, the algorithm apparently gets suspicious when too many people watch stories about government cleanup crews, which seems oddly appropriate, all things considered. Now let's drift into our second tale, where the water runs deeper than anyone expected. Story 2, Lake Mirror. Teachers as a general rule don't sleep well. It's an occupational hazard that comes with grading papers until midnight and wondering if Tommy's essay about his summer vacation was actually written by his older sister, or possibly by ChatGPT having an existential crisis. Margaret Holloway had been teaching high school English for 15 years, which meant she'd developed chronic insomnia and an unhealthy relationship with herbal tea. On nights when sleep proved particularly elusive, she'd walk down to Clearwater Lake, a modest body of water that the town optimistically called scenic, despite its resemblance to an oversized pudding. The lake was a remnant from the last ice age, carved out by glaciers that had clearly been going through their own difficult period. During the day, it reflected the sky with reasonable accuracy. At night, under Margaret's preferred conditions of solitude and insomnia, it became something more interesting, a perfect mirror that seemed to hold on to light longer than physics would typically allow. This particular evening, though evening was generous for 2:10 a.m., Margaret found herself on the old wooden pier that jutted into the water like an afterthought. Fog drifted across the surface in lazy spirals, the kind of atmospheric effect that looked magical, until you remembered it was mostly just humidity with delusions of grandeur. She was standing there, contemplating whether her lesson plan on symbolism was actually helping her students, or just making them better at overthinking everything, when the fog began behaving in ways that definitely weren't covered in her meteorology textbook. Instead of drifting randomly as fog is contractually obligated to do, it started moving in deliberate patterns, spiraling inward toward a point roughly 50 feet from the shore. Margaret watched with the sort of detached fascination that comes from being too tired to properly process what you're seeing. Then something rose from the water. It wasn't dramatic. No splashing, no waves, no Hollywood-style emergence. A black cube, perfectly geometric and about the size of a washing machine, simply appeared at the surface. But here's where things got interesting. The cube was surrounded by a sphere of soft, luminous light that pulsed gently, as if it were breathing. Margaret's first thought was that someone had dumped a very expensive piece of modern art in the lake, which seemed like exactly the sort of thing the town council would do without telling anyone. Her second thought was that modern art didn't typically emit its own light source, and it certainly didn't hover 3 feet above the water's surface. The object, cube, sphere, whatever you wanted to call this geometric identity crisis, began drawing the fog into itself. Not like a vacuum cleaner, but more like a sponge absorbing spilled coffee. The fog spiraled inward, disappearing into the light around the cube until the entire lake surface was clear as glass. Margaret fumbled for her phone, because if you're going to witness something impossible, you might as well have evidence that nobody will believe. She activated the voice memo app and began describing what she was seeing, speaking in the careful, measured tone she used when explaining metaphors to particularly dense students. "It's 2:13 a.m., she began. "I'm observing what appears to be a geometric object exhibiting unusual properties above Clearwater Lake. The fog is being absorbed in a manner inconsistent with normal atmospheric behavior." She played back the recording immediately because English teachers are compulsive about editing. What she heard was 11 minutes of continuous room tone hum. No words, no description, just the sort of white noise you'd get from a broken air conditioner. More puzzling still, the metadata showed the recording had been made yesterday, which was either a software glitch or evidence that her phone had developed its own relationship with time. While she was struggling with her clearly rebellious technology, the object completed whatever it was doing. The cube sank back into the water without so much as a ripple, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. The lake returned to its normal state of reflecting absolutely nothing interesting. Margaret stood there for several more minutes, wondering if she'd just experienced something profound, or if she needed to cut back on the late-night chamomile tea. She was about to head home when she noticed them. 2 figures standing at the end of the pier. This was impossible for several reasons. First, she would have heard footsteps on the wooden planks, which had been creaking ominously under her own weight. Second, the pier was only accessible by walking past her, and she hadn't seen anyone approach. Third, their shoes were completely dry. The men wore dark suits that looked freshly pressed despite the humid night air. They stood with perfect posture, hands clasped behind their backs, looking out at the water as if they were waiting for a particularly delayed ferry. "Beautiful night," one of them said without turning around. His voice carried the sort of pleasant authority you'd expect from a funeral director, professional, calming, and vaguely unsettling. Yes, Margaret replied, because years of teaching had trained her to respond politely to statements that weren't actually questions. Water remembers less than people, the second man added, as if this were a completely normal observation to make at 2:15 a.m. on a fog-covered lake. Margaret nodded, though she had no idea what that meant. It sounded like the sort of profound nonsense that would show up in a student's poetry assignment. Meaningful enough to sound important, vague enough to avoid actual meaning. The men turned to face her then, and Margaret noticed that their faces were unremarkable in a way that was somehow remarkable. Generic handsome, like they'd been ordered from a catalog of standard male face business model. "Have a pleasant evening, Miss Holloway," one of them said, though Margaret was certain she hadn't introduced herself. They walked past her toward shore, their footsteps making no sound on the wooden planks. Margaret watched them go, noting that their shoes left no wet prints despite the evening's humidity. When they reached the parking area, they simply weren't there anymore. Not disappeared exactly, just absent, as if they'd never been present in the first place. Margaret drove home through the empty streets, trying to process what she'd experienced. She checked the town's webcam when she got back to her apartment, curious to see if it had captured anything unusual. The camera, which normally provided a live feed of the lake area, showed clear daylight footage of the pier with no people visible, despite the fact that it was still the middle of the night. The next morning, she found something tucked under her apartment door, a small paper boat, folded from what looked like onion skin paper. Typed across the bow in neat letters were the words, "Look up less." Margaret kept the boat on her desk, next to her red pens and her gradually diminishing faith in rational explanations. She never returned to the lake at night, though she couldn't quite remember why she'd stopped going. Something about the water being too quiet, perhaps, or too good at keeping secrets. Story 3. Rest. Stop. Exit 19. Long-haul trucking is one of those professions that sounds romantic until you've actually done it. Then you realize it's mostly sitting alone for hours, drinking gas station coffee that could strip paint, and having philosophical conversations with your CB radio about whether that funny noise in the engine is expensive or just expensive. Danny Kowalski had been driving trucks for 12 years, which meant he'd seen every mile of Interstate 80, approximately 4,000 times, and could navigate by the locations of particular potholes. He knew which rest stops had clean bathrooms, almost none, which truck stops served edible food, a surprisingly short list, and which stretches of highway were best driven at night when you couldn't see how depressing the landscape actually was. Exit 19 had a rest stop that fell into the category of functional but depressing. A handful of picnic tables, some vending machines that may or may not work, and an overlook that provided a view of absolutely nothing worth overlooking. But it had good cell service and relatively few weird people, which in Danny's experience made it a 5-star establishment. He pulled in at 4:47 a.m. according to his logbook, though he'd have good reason to question that timing later. The sodium vapor lights cast everything in that particular orange glow that makes even healthy people look like they're dying of liver failure. Moths spiraled around the lights with the sort of desperate determination usually reserved for people trying to assemble IKEA furniture. Danny was checking his load straps, because cargo has an annoying tendency to develop its own opinions about physics, when he noticed the triangle. It wasn't flying exactly. It was more like sliding across the sky, maybe 300 feet up, moving with the sort of deliberate grace that suggested it knew exactly where it was going and wasn't in any particular hurry to get there. The craft was dark against the pre-dawn sky, visible mainly as a shadow that blocked out stars in a perfectly geometric pattern. What made it interesting, from a trucker's perspective, was that it rotated without changing direction. Imagine a dinner plate sliding across a table while spinning, except this dinner plate was the size of a football field and was casually violating several laws of aerodynamics. Danny had seen plenty of military aircraft during his years on the road. He'd driven through Nevada enough times to spot experimental jets, helicopters, and the occasional thing that the Air Force would probably prefer he hadn't noticed. This wasn't any of those. This moved like it had been designed by someone who found our understanding of flight quaint but ultimately unnecessary. He grabbed his CB radio because truckers are constitutionally obligated to share interesting road conditions with their fellow drivers. Breaker 19, this is Kowalski eastbound at the 19 rest stop. Anyone else seeing this light show up here? The response that came back was his own voice from what sounded like yesterday, asking, "Do you copy?" Danny stared at the radio. CB channels sometimes picked up weird signals. Skip propagation could bounce transmissions hundreds of miles, creating conversations between people who were nowhere near each other. But this was his voice, asking a question he'd been about to ask. He tried again. This is Kowalski. Anyone copy?" Again, his own voice came back. "Do you copy?" The triangle above continued its rotation, now directly overhead. Danny could see details that weren't quite right. Surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. Edges that looked sharp from one angle and curved from another. It was like looking at an optical illusion that had decided to go for a midnight flight. That's when the men appeared. Danny hadn't seen them arrive, which was odd because the rest stop was basically a well-lit parking lot with nowhere to hide. They stood near the vending machines, two figures in dark suits that looked absurdly formal for a highway rest area at 5 in the morning. One was feeding dollar bills into the soda machine, but the bills looked wrong. Different sizes, like he was using currency from several different decades. The machine accepted them anyway, which was remarkable considering that particular vending machine had been refusing to take Danny's perfectly legitimate $20 bill for the past 6 months. The man who wasn't wrestling with monetary policy walked over to Danny's truck. He had the sort of face you'd forget immediately after meeting him. Pleasant, professional, and somehow generic in a way that suggested he'd been designed by committee. "Beautiful morning," he said, though it was still dark enough that the automatic parking lot lights hadn't turned off yet. "Getting there," Danny replied, because truckers learn to be agreeable with strangers who approach them in isolated locations. "Keep tonight ordinary," the man said, as if this were completely normal advice to give someone at a rest stop. Danny nodded, though he wasn't sure what that meant. The triangle above had stopped rotating and was now moving away, sliding silently toward the eastern horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to show. "Safe travels," the man added, then walked back to his companion, who had apparently reached some sort of detente with the vending machine. Danny watched them for a moment, then decided to get back on the road. Dawn was coming, and he had a delivery schedule to keep. He climbed into his cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the interstate. It wasn't until he was merging into traffic that he noticed something wrong with his dash cam. The device recorded everything. It was required by his company's insurance policy, but when he checked the display, it showed him traveling from exit 17 directly to exit 23, with no record of stops 18 through 22. According to the camera, he'd never been to the rest stop at all. Danny tried to rationalize it. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe he'd been more tired than he thought and had imagined the whole thing. But over the next week, he kept finding fresh bug splatters on his windshield, arranged in a nearly perfect triangular pattern, despite having cleaned the glass thoroughly at each fuel stop. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he'd catch himself asking the CB radio, "Do you copy?" Though he could never quite remember why he expected an answer. Story 4. Observatory keys. There's something profoundly humbling about spending your evenings pointing expensive equipment at the universe and realizing just how insignificant you are. Jamie Torres had been the evening docent at the Riverside University Observatory for 2 years, which meant they'd developed a healthy relationship with cosmic perspective and an unhealthy relationship with instant coffee. The observatory wasn't exactly cutting edge. The main telescope dated from the 1970s and had the temperament of a moody teenager. But it served its purpose of introducing undergraduate students to the basic concept that space is really, really big and mostly empty. Which, come to think of it, wasn't a bad metaphor for most of their students' heads. Jamie's job was simple: unlock the dome at sunset, help students locate familiar constellations, explain why Pluto's demotion was scientifically justified but emotionally devastating, and lock up after everyone went home to contemplate their place in the universe or catch up on Netflix, whichever seemed more pressing. This particular evening had been uneventful in the way that October evenings usually were. Clear skies, moderate temperature, and a group of astronomy students who were more interested in taking selfies with the telescope than actually looking through it. By 11:30, Jamie had successfully explained the difference between planets and stars approximately 47 times and was ready to call it a night. They were performing the closing ritual, powering down equipment, securing the telescope, checking that all the expensive bits were properly covered, when something in the constellation Lyra caught their attention. Lyra is one of the more manageable constellations, shaped roughly like a small harp and containing Vega, one of the brightest stars in the northern sky. Jamie had pointed it out hundreds of times to students who invariably asked if it was the North Star. It's not. Or if they could see aliens from there. Probably not, but you never know. Tonight, however, Lyra had developed a new feature, a star that was strobing, not twinkling. All stars twinkle due to atmospheric interference, which is poetic until you realize it's just air pollution making pretty lights wobble. This was actual strobing, like a cosmic emergency beacon, pulsing with mechanical precision. What made it particularly unsettling was that the pulses seemed to sync with Jamie's heartbeat. When they were calm, the flashes came slowly. When they climbed the ladder to get a better look through the telescope, their pulse quickened, and so did the strobing. Jamie tried to focus the telescope on the anomaly, but the instrument had apparently decided to stage its own small rebellion. The motors whirred to life without any input, slowly slewing the telescope away from Lyra toward empty sky. When they manually overrode the system and swung it back, their saved coordinates had been overwritten with NA in the computer's memory. This was the sort of technical malfunction that would require a lengthy incident report, and probably a visit from the equipment maintenance company, whose technicians would inevitably blame user error while charging the university an enormous fee for pressing the reset button. Jamie was contemplating the paperwork nightmare ahead when they heard voices from the observatory floor below. This was odd for several reasons, not least of which was that they'd locked the building after the last students left. The observatory was on the roof of the physics building, accessible only by keycard and a certain amount of determination to climb 4 flights of stairs. "Hello?" Jamie called down, expecting to hear some sheepish undergraduates who'd hidden in the bathroom to avoid leaving. "Good evening," came the reply from a voice that was pleasant, professional, and completely unfamiliar. Jamie climbed down from the dome to find 2 men in dark suits examining the smaller teaching telescopes. They wore visitor stickers on their lapels, the kind the physics department used for guest lecturers and equipment vendors, but the date on the stickers was tomorrow. "I'm sorry," Jamie said, "but the observatory is closed for the evening. How did you get up here?" The first man looked up with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to be reassuring without being memorable. "We appreciate your cooperation," he said, as if this answered the question. His companion was adjusting the focus on one of the teaching scopes, handling the equipment with the familiarity of someone who'd worked with telescopes before. "Interesting alignment tonight," he commented, though he seemed to be looking at empty air rather than any particular celestial object. Jamie felt that peculiar combination of confusion and politeness that comes from encountering people who seem to belong somewhere they definitely shouldn't be. "Are you with the equipment maintenance company? Because we didn't have anything scheduled." "Just routine monitoring," the first man said. "We'll be finished shortly." They continued their examination of the equipment, making notes on tablets that looked expensive and possibly waterproof. Jamie watched them work, trying to figure out how they'd gotten past the locked doors and why they seemed to know more about the observatory's equipment than they did. The strobing star had stopped, they realized. Lyra looked perfectly normal again, displaying its usual collection of ancient light and cosmic indifference. "All set," the second man announced, pocketing his tablet. "Thank you for your patience. But I still don't understand how you—" Jamie began. "Have a good evening," the first man said, and they walked toward the stairwell with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested the conversation was over, whether Jamie was finished with it or not. Jamie followed them to the stairs, but when they peered over the railing, the stairwell was empty. 4 flights down, the building's main door was still locked, its security light blinking steadily. Back in the observatory, Jamie found that the night's observation log had been completed in their own handwriting, using a script they didn't remember writing. According to the log, they'd spent the evening conducting routine equipment maintenance with visiting consultants and had noted nothing unusual in the sky. The entry was dated today, written in blue ink, though Jamie exclusively used black pens. Over the next few weeks, Jamie arrived each morning to find the dome's observation slit fractionally open, despite having sealed it carefully the night before. The custodial staff insisted they never entered the observatory, and security cameras showed no unauthorized access. The only evidence of nocturnal visitors was the absence of dust on the telescope controls, and a lingering sense that someone had been watching the sky with far more interest and far more knowledge than any undergraduate astronomy course would require. Story 5. Janitor's Cart, Night Shift. Janitorial work is one of those jobs that sounds peaceful until you realize you're essentially a security guard with a mop, responsible for cleaning up after people who apparently never learned that trash cans exist. Marcus Williams had been working the night shift at the Meridian Tower for 6 years, which meant he developed an intimate relationship with the building's quirks and a professional appreciation for the fact that lawyers generate an extraordinary amount of garbage. The Meridian Tower was downtown's attempt at architectural significance. 30 floors of glass and steel that looked impressive from a distance and like a filing cabinet up close. During the day, it buzzed with the sort of purposeful activity that made people feel important while accomplishing surprisingly little. At night, it became Marcus's domain. 40,000 square feet of empty offices, humming elevators, and the occasional abandoned coffee mug that had achieved a level of mold growth that bordered on scientific breakthrough. Marcus preferred the night shift. No people meant no one to explain why he needed to vacuum around their feet, no executives pretending they didn't see him while discussing sensitive matters, and no one to complain that the elevator music was stuck on a perpetual loop of instrumentalized pop songs from the 1980s. On this particular Tuesday, or technically Wednesday, since it was 1:15 a.m., Marcus was working the 22nd floor, methodically emptying trash cans and wondering why people threw away so many individually wrapped breath mints. The floor housed a collection of mid-level marketing firms and consulting companies, the sort of businesses that generated impressive PowerPoint presentations and remarkably little actual productivity. He was wheeling his cart between cubicles when he noticed something unusual through the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the neighboring office building. The lights in the opposite tower were moving, not turning on and off in the random pattern you'd expect from a building where a few people were working late. These lights were flowing across the windows in organized waves like schools of fish swimming through an aquarium made of glass and concrete. Marcus paused his cart and walked to the window for a better look. The neighboring building was roughly the same height as Meridian Tower, its windows dark except for this strange cascade of illumination that rippled from floor to floor. The lights had a bluish quality that wasn't quite right for standard office fluorescence, and they moved with an organic rhythm that seemed almost alive. He pulled out his phone to record what he was seeing, because if you witness something impossible, You might as well have evidence that nobody will believe. But when he held up the device, the screen showed only his own reflection in the window. No lights, no movement, just empty office windows staring back at him like dead eyes. Marcus lowered the phone and looked again with his naked eyes. The lights were still there, still flowing in those hypnotic patterns. He raised the phone again. Nothing. Just dark windows and his increasingly confused expression. This was the sort of technical malfunction that would normally send him to the IT department, except that the IT department consisted of one guy named Derek, who believed that turning things off and on again could solve everything from software glitches to existential crises. Derek was probably not equipped to handle phones that selectively refused to record impossible phenomena. Marcus was contemplating whether this qualified as a maintenance issue when he heard the elevator chime behind him. This was unusual for several reasons, not least of which was that he hadn't called an elevator, and the building's after-hours security system required key card access for anyone who wasn't supposed to be there. He turned to see the elevator doors slide open on the 21st floor, visible through the open stairwell. No one stepped out. A moment later, he heard another chime from the 23rd floor, and another set of doors opened to reveal an empty elevator car. This continued for several minutes, elevator doors opening and closing on floors above and below him, as if invisible passengers were boarding and exiting at every level. The building's elevator system was old enough to have personality quirks, but this was beyond quirky. This was either a major malfunction or evidence that the building had developed its own ideas about vertical transportation. Marcus grabbed his radio to call building security, but before he could key the microphone, two men stepped out of the elevator on his floor. Not the elevators he'd been watching, but the one directly behind him, which hadn't made any sound at all. They wore dark suits that looked freshly pressed despite the late hour and moved with the sort of synchronized precision that suggested they'd practiced walking together. Their faces were pleasantly unremarkable, the kind of generically handsome features you'd see in a corporate stock photo titled Professional Business Team. "Evening," one of them said, though it was well past evening and deep into that liminal time when night workers start questioning their life choices. "You didn't see what you don't remember," the second man added, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to say to a janitor at 1:30 a.m. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure why. The statement had a strange logic to it. If you don't remember something, then effectively you didn't see it, right? It was the sort of philosophical puzzle that seemed profound when you were tired and working alone in an empty building. The men walked past him toward the emergency exit, their footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. Marcus watched them go, noting that their shadows seemed oddly faint under the bright office lighting. When they reached the stairwell door, they simply weren't there anymore. Not gone through the door, just absent, as if they'd been edited out of reality. Marcus looked back toward the neighboring building. The flowing lights had stopped, leaving behind a grid of dark windows that reflected the city's normal, nighttime illumination. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, which somehow made it more unsettling than the impossible light show. He returned to his cart and continued his rounds, but something felt different about the familiar routine. When he checked his time card later, he discovered that the automated system had marked him for a break from 1:11 to 1:28, though he had no memory of taking a break. More puzzling still, the pen in his shirt pocket, a cheap ballpoint he'd grabbed from the supply closet, was now leaking clear ink instead of blue. The next morning, Marcus arrived to find a new sign installed near the emergency stairwell. "Fire exit," with an arrow pointing directly at a blank wall. By the following evening, the sign had vanished, leaving behind only 4 small holes in the drywall where the mounting screws had been. Marcus never mentioned the incident to building security or his supervisor, partly because he wasn't sure how to explain what he'd seen, and partly because he had the distinct impression that some experiences were better left undocumented. But he did start carrying a small digital camera in addition to his phone, and he made a point of checking the neighboring building's windows each night. The lights never returned, but sometimes he'd catch a glimpse of his own reflection in those distant windows, even when he wasn't standing near any reflective surface. And occasionally, when the elevator chimed at floors he hadn't called, he'd find himself nodding and murmuring, "You didn't see what you don't remember," though he could never quite recall why that phrase seemed so important. Story 6. Desert Mile Marker, 47. Solo road trips through the American Southwest are either deeply spiritual experiences or extended exercises in questioning your sanity, sometimes both, depending on how long you've been driving and how much gas station coffee you've consumed. Elena Vasquez had been on the road for 8 hours, crossing the high desert of New Mexico on a route that existed primarily to connect two places that most people had never heard of. She was driving from her sister's wedding in Albuquerque to a new job in Phoenix, taking the scenic route because she'd never seen this part of the country, and because the alternative involved 3 more hours on Interstate 40, which offered all the natural beauty of a concrete drainage ditch. The highway she'd chosen wound through landscape that looked like Mars, with better cell phone coverage, all red rock formations, and impossibly wide skies that made you feel simultaneously insignificant and privileged to witness such emptiness. It was the kind of drive that cleared your head and reminded you why people wrote songs about the American road, assuming those people had never actually tried to find decent food or clean bathrooms in rural New Mexico. Elena had packed accordingly. Plenty of water, trail mix that claimed to be energy boosting, but tasted like cardboard with delusions of grandeur, and a Polaroid camera because her phone's battery was dying faster than her patience with GPS directions that seemed to have been programmed by someone who'd never actually driven this route. At mile marker 47, she pulled over at a scenic overlook that offered a view of absolutely nothing as far as the horizon, which, in the desert, was actually quite beautiful. Miles of sagebrush and distant mountains that shimmered in the late afternoon heat, like a mirage of geological stability. Elena stepped out of her car to stretch her legs and take some photos because if you're going to drive through the middle of nowhere, you might as well document the experience for people who are smart enough to stay home. The air was dry and warm, carrying that distinctive desert smell of dust and ancient plant life that had given up trying to be green. She was adjusting her camera settings when she noticed something unusual on the horizon. A cylindrical object hung above the highway about a mile ahead, motionless and dark against the pale sky. At first glance, it looked like it might be a water tower or radio antenna, except that it was floating approximately 300 feet above the asphalt, with no visible means of support. Elena raised her camera for a better look through the telephoto lens. The object was definitely cylindrical, maybe 60 feet long, and perfectly smooth, like a giant metal tube that someone had carelessly left hovering over a desert highway. What made it particularly interesting was how the light seemed to behave around it. Cars were approaching from both directions, a few sparse dots of traffic on the long, straight road. As their headlights reached the area beneath the cylinder, the light beams curved, bending upward around the object as if the air itself had become a lens. It was the sort of optical effect that would make a physics professor very excited and everyone else very nervous. Elena loaded a fresh cartridge into her Polaroid camera and took a shot of the scene. The camera made its familiar mechanical whir and ejected the photo, which she set aside to develop while keeping her eye on the mysterious object. A minute later, she picked up the Polaroid to check the image. Instead of the desert highway with its impossible floating cylinder, the photo showed only a uniform gray gradient, like she'd accidentally photographed a piece of construction paper. She shook the image, thinking it might not have developed properly, but the gray remained stubbornly featureless. Elena tried again with a different angle, then a third time focused directly on the object. Each photograph came out the same. Perfect gray gradients that revealed nothing about what she was clearly seeing with her own eyes. By the time she'd wasted half a cartridge of film, the photographs had begun turning completely black, as if they were being overexposed to some invisible light source. That's when she noticed the men. They were walking toward each other from opposite directions along the highway's shoulder, two figures in dark suits who seemed remarkably well dressed for a stroll through the New Mexican desert. What made their appearance particularly noteworthy was that Elena hadn't seen them arrive. No cars had stopped, no side roads intersected the highway at this point, and the terrain was flat enough that she should have spotted anyone approaching from miles away. The men met precisely in the center of her field of view, directly beneath the hovering cylinder. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped behind their backs, looking up at the object like tourists admiring a monument. Then, in perfect synchronization, they turned to look at Elena. Even at a distance, she could see them clearly. Pale, unremarkable faces beneath dark hair, professional poseurs that suggested they were conducting some sort of business meeting in one of the most isolated locations in North America. One of them raised his hand in what might have been a greeting, or might have been a signal. Elena felt compelled to walk toward them, though she couldn't quite explain why. Something about their presence seemed to require acknowledgement, like they were officials she was supposed to check in with before proceeding. She locked her car and started across the scrub brush that separated the overlook from the highway. As she got closer, the cylindrical object became more detailed and somehow less comprehensible. Its surface didn't reflect light so much as absorb it, creating a patch of visual emptiness in the bright desert sky. The distortion effect on passing car headlights was more pronounced, up close, bending beams of light in ways that made her eyes water. "It isn't healthy to dwell," one of the men said when she was within conversational distance. His voice carried clearly in the thin desert air, though he hadn't raised it above normal speaking volume. Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. The statement seemed reasonable enough. Dwelling on things was generally considered unhealthy, wasn't it? Better to keep moving, keep looking forward, avoid getting stuck in analysis paralysis. "Beautiful country," the second man added, gesturing toward the landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Very conducive to clear thinking." "Yes," Elena replied because it seemed rude not to respond. The desert was beautiful in its stark, unforgiving way, and it did seem to clear your mind, stripping away unnecessary thoughts until only the essential remained. The men smiled with identical expressions of professional satisfaction, as if they'd completed a successful transaction. They began walking away in opposite directions, each returning to whichever impossibly distant point they'd come from. Elena watched them go, then looked up at the cylindrical object. It was gone, not fading or flying away, just absent from the sky as if it had never been there. The highway looked perfectly normal, carrying its sparse traffic under an unremarkable afternoon sky. She walked back to her car, feeling oddly relaxed and purposeful. The drive to Phoenix seemed less daunting now, more like a simple journey between 2 points rather than an existential trek across the wasteland. She'd definitely made good time. According to her odometer, she'd somehow gained 7 miles while parked at the overlook, though her fuel gauge showed no corresponding decrease. That evening, when she stopped for gas in Flagstaff, Elena discovered that mile marker 47 didn't exist on her route. According to the state highway map and her GPS, the markers jumped from 46 directly to 48, with no scenic overlook marked anywhere in that section. The gas station attendant, when she asked about it, insisted that particular stretch of highway had always had that numbering system. "Been driving that road for 20 years, he told her. "Never been a marker 47 out there." Elena nodded and paid for her gas, because sometimes it's easier to accept local knowledge than to argue with reality. But she kept the blank Polaroids in her glove compartment, along with a growing suspicion that some experiences were designed to be forgotten as soon as they were over. Story 7. Greenhouse Hiss. Retirement, Bob Henley had discovered, was mostly about finding new ways to worry about the same things you'd been worrying about for 40 years, except now you had more time to really focus on the worrying. After 35 years of teaching high school biology, he'd thought he understood the basic principles of plant growth, soil chemistry, and adolescent attention spans. Turns out he'd only mastered the last one. His greenhouse was a testament to optimistic planning and questionable construction skills, a plastic tunnel structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd heard about greenhouses but had never actually seen one. Bob had assembled it himself using instructions that were apparently translated from another language by someone who spoke neither the original nor English particularly well. The result was a functional growing space that creaked ominously in moderate winds and developed mysterious leaks during every rainstorm. But it served its purpose, extending the growing season for tomatoes that probably weren't worth the effort and providing Bob with a legitimate excuse to avoid his neighbors' discussions about property values and the moral decline of modern society. At 5:30 a.m., when the rest of the world was still debating whether to get out of bed, Bob could tend his plants in peaceful solitude while pretending he was doing something agriculturally significant. The greenhouse sat at the edge of his property, backing up to a small patch of woods that the city had designated as natural space, but which Bob suspected was really just land too steep and rocky to develop profitably. It was quiet back there except for the occasional squirrel conducting what sounded like complex engineering projects in the tree canopy, and the distant hum of the interstate that carried early commuters toward jobs they probably didn't particularly enjoy. On this particular October morning, Bob was checking his late-season tomatoes and wondering why he'd thought growing Cherokee purples was a good idea, when they looked more like Cherokee disappointments. The plants were healthy enough, but the fruit development had been sluggish, as if the tomatoes were having second thoughts about the whole ripening process. He was adjusting plant stakes when he noticed something odd about the condensation patterns inside the greenhouse. Normally, moisture collected on the plastic walls and dripped downward, following the basic gravitational principles that had worked reliably since the formation of the universe. This morning, however, some of the water droplets were moving uphill, not dramatically, just a slow migration of individual beads of water that seemed to be ignoring the conventional rules about which direction was down. Bob watched one particular droplet make its way up the slanted wall, pausing occasionally as if it were resting before continuing its impossible journey toward the roof. This was the sort of phenomenon that would have sent his former biology students into fits of excited speculation about alien intervention or government conspiracy, both of which Bob had spent decades gently correcting with tedious facts about surface tension and atmospheric pressure. Now, faced with his own classroom demonstration of physics gone wrong, he found himself considerably less confident about the explanations. He was crouched down, trying to get a better angle on the upward flowing condensation, when a shadow passed over the greenhouse. This wouldn't normally be noteworthy. Clouds, birds, and low-flying aircraft all cast shadows on a regular basis without requiring scientific investigation. But this shadow had no corresponding object. Bob looked up through the translucent plastic roof and saw clear sky. No clouds, no birds, no aircraft of any description. Yet the shadow had been distinct and definite, moving from east to west at a steady pace that suggested something substantial passing overhead. Something substantial and completely invisible, which violated several principles of optics that Bob had taught with confidence for most of his adult life. He stood up, brushing soil off his knees, and reached for his phone to check if there were any military exercises scheduled for the area. Sometimes jets flew high enough to be inaudible while still casting shadows, though that didn't explain the visibility issue. The phone's screen showed a perfectly reasonable 5:47 a.m., but when he tried to open the weather app, the device became mysteriously uncooperative, not frozen exactly, just reluctant to respond to his touches, as if it were having second thoughts about providing information. When he finally managed to access his photo gallery, he discovered that it had reorganized itself overnight. All of his recent photos had been moved to a folder labeled "Recently Deleted," despite the fact that he hadn't deleted anything. More puzzling still, the folder was set to auto-empty, counting down from 23 hours and 14 minutes until permanent deletion. Bob had never set up any such system. He barely understood how to take photos, much less organize them into self-destructing folders. While he was struggling with his apparently sentient phone, he heard voices outside the greenhouse. This was unusual because his nearest neighbors were half a mile away, and it was barely dawn on a Tuesday. Most people had better things to do at this hour than visit amateur greenhouses in suburban backyards. "Good morning," someone said, though Bob couldn't see anyone through the translucent walls. Two figures were visible as dark silhouettes against the early light. Tall, well-dressed shapes that moved with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested they had legitimate business being there. Bob unzipped the greenhouse entrance, wondering if he was about to be cited for some municipal violation he didn't know existed. The men wore dark suits that looked remarkably clean for people who had presumably walked through the woods and across his yard. Their shoes showed no signs of dew or soil, despite the fact that Bob's own boots were thoroughly moistened from walking across the grass. "Plants grow best in peace," one of them said, as if this were a perfectly normal opening for a conversation with a retiree in a plastic greenhouse. Bob nodded, because it seemed like sound agricultural advice. Plants did generally prefer peaceful environments. No loud noises, no sudden temperature changes, no dramatic disruptions to their routine. He'd spent years explaining this concept to students who thought you could improve plant growth by playing heavy metal music or talking to them in encouraging voices. "We noticed you've been having some interesting weather patterns," the second man added, glancing around the greenhouse interior with the practiced eye of someone who understood controlled growing environments. "Just condensation," Bob replied, though as he spoke, he noticed that the upward-flowing water droplets had stopped their impossible migration and were now behaving according to normal gravitational principles. The men smiled with identical expressions of professional satisfaction, as if they'd successfully completed a routine service call. "Thank you for your the first one said. Then they turned and walked toward the woods with the same synchronized precision they'd used to approach. Bob watched them go, noting that they left no footprints in the soft soil near the tree line, and made no sound as they pushed through the underbrush. By the time he'd zipped up the greenhouse entrance and turned back to his tomatoes, he'd somehow lost track of why he'd found their visit noteworthy. The plants looked healthier, he noticed. The Cherokee purples had developed a promising blush of color overnight, and the condensation patterns were exactly what you'd expect in a properly functioning greenhouse. Everything was perfectly normal, which was exactly how Bob preferred his retirement activities. Though he did find it odd that his phone's photo gallery had reorganized itself, and he couldn't quite remember why he'd been so concerned about water droplets that clearly flowed in the only direction water droplets could possibly flow. Story 8. Breakwater Beacon. Lighthouse keeping is one of those professions that sounds romantic until you realize it mostly involves maintenance, paperwork, and explaining to tourists that, no, you can't actually see ships on the horizon from here. And yes, the light does turn on automatically now, which is why we don't need someone sitting up there with a match anymore. Catherine Mills had volunteered for the overnight shift at Point Refuge Light, not because she harbored any romantic notions about maritime heroism, but because she needed the community service hours for her maritime history degree, and because someone had to babysit the restoration work being done on the beacon mechanism. The lighthouse had been automated since 1987, but the Historical Society was determined to restore it to authentic working condition, which mostly meant spending enormous amounts of money to make it work exactly the same way it had been working with modern equipment. Point Refuge. Light sat on a rocky outcropping that jutted into Lake Superior like a concrete finger pointing at Canada. It wasn't the tallest lighthouse on the Great Lakes, or the most historically significant, but it had the distinction of being the only lighthouse in the region that still required overnight volunteers during maintenance periods, mostly because the insurance company insisted on having someone present in case the contractors did something spectacularly stupid with 19th century machinery. Catherine had drawn the Tuesday night shift, which meant she got to spend 12 hours in a drafty lighthouse with a thermos of coffee that would be cold by midnight, and a stack of maritime history texts that she was supposed to be reading for her thesis on economic impacts of automated navigation systems. It was exactly as thrilling as it sounded, which is to say, not at all, but the solitude was good for concentration, and the lighthouse had surprisingly decent Wi-Fi. The beacon completed its rotation every 10 seconds, sweeping across the dark water with the mechanical precision that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. Catherine had counted the rotations enough times to establish the rhythm. Sweep, pause, sweep, pause, sweep. A hypnotic cycle that made excellent background noise for reading about the economic decline of lighthouse keeper employment. At 2:14 a.m., according to her meticulously kept log, the beacon completed 5 rotations. This was mathematically impossible. Catherine had been tracking the light pattern for hours, partly out of boredom and partly because she suspected the restoration work had affected the timing mechanism. 4 sweeps per rotation, 10 seconds per cycle, no variations. It was as reliable as a Swiss watch, if Swiss watches weighed several tons and required monthly maintenance. But she definitely counted 5 sweeps: north, east, south, west, and then a 5th sweep that continued past north toward some undefined direction that wasn't represented on any compass she'd ever seen. The extra sweep illuminated nothing. No water, no land, just darkness that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Catherine grabbed the maintenance logbook to record the anomaly, but when she tried to write, the ink seemed to move on the page. Not dramatically, just a subtle rippling, as if the paper were breathing. More unsettling still, her careful log entries were rearranging themselves. The timestamps remained the same, but the text had transposed lines, creating sentences like, "Beacon operational, contractors departed, weather clear, mechanical precision maintained, no unusual observations." She definitely hadn't written "no unusual observations." She'd been planning to write exactly the opposite. The spiral staircase that wound up the interior of the lighthouse creaked with the sort of regular settling sounds that old structures make when they're dealing with temperature changes and the ongoing stress of existing. Catherine had grown accustomed to the rhythm of these sounds over the course of the evening. Expand, contract, settle, repeat. What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the sound of footsteps on the stairs below her. This was problematic for several reasons. First, she'd locked the lighthouse door when the contractors left at 6 p.m., and she had the only key. Second, she'd been monitoring the stairs all evening, and no one had passed her position in the lamp room. Third, the footsteps were coming from below her, but she was at the bottom of the spiral. There was nowhere lower to climb from. "Hello?" She called down the stairwell, expecting to hear some sheepish explanation from a contractor who'd forgotten a tool or a tourist who'd somehow bypassed the locked entrance. "Good evening," came the reply from 2 voices speaking in perfect unison, which was unsettling in the way that most synchronized responses tend to be. Catherine peered over the railing and saw them. 2 men in dark suits climbing the spiral stairs with the sort of measured pace that suggested they had all the time in the world. Their shoes made crisp, clean sounds on the metal steps. No scuff of rubber soles, no squeak of leather, just precise metallic clicks that echoed in the confined space. What made their presence particularly noteworthy was that their shoes showed no signs of salt spray or moisture, despite the fact that reaching the lighthouse required crossing approximately 50 yards of wave-soaked rocks. Catherine's own boots were thoroughly dampened from her earlier inspection of the exterior maintenance work. "I'm sorry," she said as they approached, "but the lighthouse is closed for maintenance. How did you get in?" The first man reached the lamp room level and smiled with the sort of professional courtesy that suggested he'd been asked this question many times before. "Just routine inspection," he said, as if this explained both his presence and his apparent ability to bypass locked doors. His companion was examining the beacon mechanism with the practiced eye of someone familiar with lighthouse operations. "Navigation works better without stories," he commented, though he seemed to be addressing the light fixture rather than Catherine. This was the sort of cryptic observation that would normally send Catherine into thesis writing mode, analyzing the relationship between maritime folklore and modern navigation systems. But somehow it seemed perfectly reasonable, as if stories were indeed counterproductive to the basic function of helping ships find their way safely to harbor. The men continued their inspection, making notes on waterproof tablets and discussing technical specifications in voices too low for Catherine to follow. They worked with the efficiency of professionals who'd performed this routine many times before, though Catherine was certain the lighthouse had never been scheduled for any nighttime inspections. "All set," the second man announced after examining the beacon's rotation mechanism. "Thank you for your assistance." "But I still don't understand," Catherine began. "Safe travels," the first man said, and they began their descent down the spiral stairs with the same synchronized precision they'd used to climb up. Catherine followed them to the railing and watched them disappear around the curve of the stairwell. Their footsteps continued for exactly the right amount of time to reach the bottom, but when she made her way down to check, the lighthouse door was still locked from the inside, and no one was visible on the rocky approach to the structure. Back in the lamp room, she discovered that her maintenance log had been completed in her own handwriting. According to the entries, she'd spent the evening conducting routine beacon calibration with visiting marine safety inspectors and had observed standard 4-sweep rotation patterns throughout the night. The entry was dated correctly, written in black ink, though Catherine exclusively used blue pens for official documentation. Over the next several weeks, she found herself drawn back to the lighthouse during her free time, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The beacon operated normally, completing its 4-sweep rotation with mechanical precision. But sometimes, late at night, when the lake was particularly dark, she'd catch herself counting north, east, south, west, and waiting for a 5th sweep that never came. The AIS ship tracking system showed no unusual vessel activity in the area, but occasionally Catherine would spot a gull carrying something in its beak, usually small fish or bits of seaweed. One morning, she found a brass key on the lighthouse steps, engraved with the number 0. She tried it on every lock she could find, but it didn't fit anything on the property. She kept the key anyway, carrying it in her pocket like a talisman against questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. And sometimes, when she was reading her maritime history texts, she'd find herself unconsciously turning the key over in her fingers, wondering what door it might open if she ever found the right lock. Story 9. Campus Lawn, 314. Graduate school has a way of turning normal people into nocturnal creatures who survive on caffeine and existential dread, measuring their days in pages written rather than hours slept. Alex Restrepo had been working on their dissertation for 18 months, which meant they'd developed an intimate relationship with the university library's extended hours and a professional appreciation for the fact that academic insights often arrived at inconvenient times. At 3:14 a.m. on a Thursday, that was technically Friday, Alex was making their way across the main quad after a particularly productive session in the stacks. Their dissertation on quantum entanglement as metaphor in contemporary literature had finally begun to coalesce into something resembling an argument, though they suspected this might be the caffeine talking rather than genuine academic breakthrough. The quad was one of those classic university spaces that looked impressive in recruitment brochures and felt appropriately scholarly during daylight hours, when it buzzed with the sort of intellectual energy that made people feel smart just by proximity. At night, it became a vast expanse of darkness punctuated by inadequate lighting and the occasional student having what appeared to be a philosophical crisis near the statue of the university's founder. Alex preferred the night campus. No crowds meant you could walk in straight lines instead of navigating around groups of undergraduates who moved like schools of fish. apparently guided by some collective consciousness that prioritized social interaction over efficient pedestrian traffic. The silence was conducive to thinking, and there was something satisfying about being one of the few people awake and productive while the rest of the world slept off their more sensible life choices. They were halfway across the quad, contemplating whether their chapter on narrative entanglement was brilliant or complete nonsense, when they noticed something unusual about the sky above. The stars were rearranging themselves, not dramatically, no cosmic explosions or celestial pyrotechnics, just a subtle shifting of familiar constellations into geometric patterns that definitely weren't covered in any astronomy textbook Alex had ever encountered. The Big Dipper was blinking in sequence, each star pulsing in turn like a cosmic animation. Orion appeared to be sending Morse code, though Alex's knowledge of Morse code was limited to SOS and the vague recollection that it involved dots and dashes. What made this particularly unsettling was that the stellar reorganization seemed to be creating a grid pattern, a vast coordinate system imposed on the night sky as if someone were running a celestial mapping survey. The grid pulsed gently, creating a parallax effect that made Alex feel slightly seasick despite being firmly planted on solid ground. They fumbled for their smartwatch to record their heart rate, partly out of scientific curiosity and partly because they suspected they might be having some sort of stress-induced episode. Graduate school had a way of pushing people past their psychological limits, and Alex had heard stories of students who'd experienced elaborate hallucinations during particularly intense research periods. The watch showed a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute, which was odd because Alex was fairly certain their heart was racing. More strange still, the display showed this exact heart rate maintained for the past 11 minutes, creating a perfect sine wave pattern that was mathematically beautiful and biologically impossible. Alex was contemplating whether this represented a technological malfunction or evidence of some sort of cardiac anomaly when they noticed the men approaching from opposite sides of the quad. They wore Letterman jackets over their dark suits, which was a sartorial choice that suggested either a nostalgic alumnus or someone with a very confused understanding of appropriate evening attire. The jackets bore the university's colors but displayed a crest Alex didn't recognize, some sort of geometric design that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The men walked with the synchronized precision that Alex had come to associate with military honor, guards, or very well-rehearsed performance art. They approached along converging paths that would bring them together at the exact center of the quad, where Alex happened to be standing and contemplating cosmic geometry. "You're doing fine," the first man said when they'd reached conversational distance. His voice carried the sort of gentle authority that professors used when delivering difficult feedback to struggling students. "Keep walking." Alex nodded, though they weren't sure why. The advice seemed sound enough. Walking was generally a good strategy for getting from one place to another, and they had been planning to continue across the quad regardless. There was something reassuring about receiving confirmation that their current approach to pedestrian navigation was acceptable. The second man was looking up at the star grid with the expression of someone checking the progress of routine maintenance work. "Beautiful night for observation," he commented, though the sky looked perfectly normal now, just the usual arrangement of constellations that had been guiding navigation for millennia. "Yes," Alex replied, because it was a beautiful night. Clear, mild temperature, low humidity, ideal conditions for astronomical observation or late-night campus walking, depending on your priorities. The men smiled with identical expressions of professional satisfaction and continued their synchronized walk across the quad, disappearing into the darkness with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested they had other appointments to keep and other students to reassure about their pedestrian choices. Alex completed their journey to the graduate dormitory, feeling oddly energized despite the late hour. The night's work had been productive, their chapter was taking shape, and they'd received unexpected confirmation that their basic navigation skills were adequate for academic success. It wasn't until they swiped their ID card to enter the building that they discovered a problem with their evening's timeline. According to the card reader's log, they'd been in the library stacks for the entire evening, with no record of ever leaving the building. The system showed continuous access to their study, Carrel, from 8 p.m. until the current moment, despite the fact that they'd clearly spent at least 20 minutes walking across campus. More puzzling still, their laptop's search history showed an extensive session researching stellar cartography and astronomical navigation systems, though Alex had no memory of looking up anything related to astronomy. Their dissertation dealt with literary theory and quantum mechanics as metaphor, not practical star navigation. Over the next few weeks, Alex found themselves drawn to nighttime campus walks, though they couldn't articulate why. The quad looked perfectly normal during these expeditions. Standard university landscaping, familiar constellations, no mysterious men in Letterman jackets offering pedestrian advice. But each morning they'd find a small chalk message on their usual path across the quad. Simply, "OK," written in neat block letters. The message would be gone by afternoon, worn away by foot traffic or deliberately erased by maintenance crews. Alex never mentioned these messages to anyone, partly because they weren't sure how to explain the significance of receiving ongoing confirmation that their basic existence was proceeding according to acceptable parameters. But they did start carrying chalk in their backpack, and sometimes they'd find themselves writing "OK" on random sidewalks around campus, though they could never quite remember why this seemed important. Story 10. Return to the field. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Chen's encounter with the 9 lights above the soybean field, though she'd found it increasingly difficult to remember exactly what she'd seen or why it had seemed significant at the time. Graduate school had a way of consuming your attention, and atmospheric physics waited for no one's mysterious experiences with unidentified flying objects. But something kept drawing her back to that stretch of Highway 9, usually around midnight when the roads were empty, and she had the rural darkness to herself. She told herself it was scientific curiosity. If there was some atmospheric phenomenon occurring in that specific location, it deserved investigation. More honestly, she was hoping to see the lights again, if only to confirm that she hadn't imagined the entire experience. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The air had that electric quality that sometimes preceded thunderstorms, though the weather forecast had promised clear skies. Her car's AM radio crackled with more static than usual, occasionally picking up fragments of distant conversations in languages she didn't recognize. Sarah pulled over at the same spot where she'd first noticed the lights, parking on the gravel shoulder with her headlights pointing toward the soybean field. The crops had been harvested since her last visit, leaving behind stubbled rows that stretched into darkness like the skeleton of some vast agricultural beast. She waited for 20 minutes, watching the empty field and wondering if she was developing the sort of obsessive behavior that psychology textbooks warned about in their chapters on stress-induced fixation. Graduate students were apparently prone to elaborate coping mechanisms, and maybe midnight UFO watching was her particular form of academic decompression. Then she saw it, a single, dull, white sphere, rising from the harvested field like a belated moon. Not 9 lights this time, just one, moving in that same hypnotic arc pattern she remembered from before. But something was wrong with its timing. The sphere followed the familiar path, but lagged behind some invisible schedule, as if it were trying to synchronize with a rhythm it couldn't quite match. Sarah reached for her phone, remembering how the camera had malfunctioned during her previous encounter. This time, she'd come prepared with a proper digital camera borrowed from the journalism department, complete with night photography settings and enough battery life to document several hours of atmospheric anomalies. The camera worked perfectly, capturing crisp images of the lone sphere as it completed its arc above the field. But when Sarah reviewed the photos on the camera's display, they showed something impossible. Her earlier self, standing in the same field 3 weeks ago, watching 9 lights that weren't visible in the current images. The photographs depicted that first night with perfect clarity. Sarah's red jacket, her frustrated attempts to use her phone camera, even the expression of wonder and confusion on her face, as she watched the original light formation. But overlaying these historical images was her present self, slightly transparent, like a double exposure that showed two different times occupying the same space. She lowered the camera and looked back at the field. The single sphere had completed its arc and was hovering near the tree line, pulsing with a gentle rhythm that seemed almost expectant, as if it were waiting for something or someone. That's when she heard the car doors. Two vehicles had pulled up behind her while she'd been focused on the field, though she hadn't heard them approach. A black sedan idled quietly on the road, its engine making no sound despite the visible heat shimmer from the exhaust. The car had been there before, she realized, parked by the grain silos during her previous visits, always present but never quite noticed. Two men emerged from the sedan with the sort of synchronized precision that suggested they'd practiced this particular entrance. They wore the same dark suits Sarah remembered from the gas station, though something was different about them now. Their movements were slightly out of phase with each other, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Good evening, Ms. Chen," the first man said, though his voice reached her a fraction of a second after his lips stopped moving, as if the sound were traveling through water rather than air. "The sky is safer when it's empty," the second man added, delivering the same cryptic line Sarah remembered from their previous encounter. But this time, the words arrived half a beat late, creating an unsettling echo effect that made her ears ring. One of them smiled, and the expression was wrong. Too wide, lasting too long, like someone who'd learned to smile from a manual rather than natural experience. The smile spread across his face in slow motion, reaching maximum width just as his companion began. The same, identical expression. Sarah found herself nodding in agreement, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. The sky probably was safer when it was empty, fewer things to worry about, fewer complications for air, traffic, control, fewer opportunities for inexplicable encounters with impossible phenomena. The men returned to their car, moving with that same delayed synchronization. The sedan pulled away without sound, its headlights creating strange trails in Sarah's peripheral vision, as if the light were having trouble keeping up with the vehicle. She looked back at the field. The single sphere was gone, but something had been left behind. A perfect circle in the stubbled earth, approximately 30 feet in diameter, where the harvested soybean stalks had been arranged in a spiral pattern. Sarah walked to the edge of the circle, noting that the pattern was too precise to be natural and too large to have been created quickly. The stalks spiraled inward toward an empty center, creating a mandala-like design that was beautiful and somehow unsettling. In the center of the circle, she found a piece of paper, the same blank receipt from the gas station that she'd received weeks ago, but it was no longer blank. A single line of text had appeared. "Thank you." Sarah pocketed the receipt and returned to her car, feeling oddly satisfied despite not understanding what she was being thanked for. The drive home was peaceful, taking her through familiar countryside that looked exactly as it should. No missing mile markers, no impossible geometries, just ordinary rural Illinois under a sky that held exactly the number of stars it was supposed to. But as she reached her apartment, Sarah realized she could no longer remember why she'd been driving to that particular field, or what she'd expected to find there. The photographs on her camera showed only darkness, no lights, no double exposures, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. She did find it odd that she had a gas station receipt in her pocket with "thank you" printed on it, especially since she hadn't bought gas that evening. But receipts were unreliable things, and maybe she'd picked it up from her car floor where abandoned receipts went to create archaeological layers of forgotten purchases. Sarah went to bed thinking about her thesis, about atmospheric phenomena, and about the peculiar satisfaction that came from completing something important, even if you couldn't quite remember what it was you'd completed. Outside her window, The night settled into familiar patterns. Distant traffic, settling buildings, the occasional siren heading somewhere urgent. Everything was perfectly ordinary, which was exactly how most people preferred their Tuesday nights to be. In the soybean field, the spiral pattern gradually disappeared over the next few days, worn away by wind and rain until nothing remained but harvested stubble arranged in neat rows. The black sedans stopped appearing by the grain silos. The AM radio static returned to normal levels, and somewhere in a filing cabinet that didn't officially exist, a case file was marked resolved and filed away alongside thousands of others, waiting patiently for the next time someone looked up at the sky and saw something they weren't supposed to see. But that, as they say, is another story. And so we reach the end of our quiet journey through 10 encounters with the universe's most polite cleanup crew. 10 ordinary people who witnessed the extraordinary, only to discover that some experiences prefer to remain officially unexperienced. We've drifted through soybean fields and lighthouse beams, desert highways and university observatories, following witnesses whose only crime was looking up at the wrong moment or staying awake when the rest of the world had sensibly gone to sleep. Each encountered those immaculately dressed gentlemen who arrive after the impossible has been witnessed, armed with nothing more threatening than perfect manners and an unsettling ability to make problems disappear. Perhaps what makes these tales so unsettling isn't the strangeness of what was seen, but the gentleness of what followed. No dramatic confrontations, no threats or intimidation, just polite men in dark suits offering cryptic wisdom about empty skies and peaceful plants, about not dwelling on things that might be healthy or forgotten. They remind us that some mysteries are designed to remain mysterious. Some experiences are meant to fade like morning mist, and some questions are better left unasked until we're better equipped to handle the answers. As you drift towards sleep, let these stories settle gently in the back of your mind, where they can join the collection of half-remembered dreams and almost glimpsed wonders that make life interesting, without making it complicated. Let the questions wait for morning when daylight will make everything seem perfectly reasonable again. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. And if you happen to see something impossible on your way to tomorrow, remember, sometimes the kindest thing the universe can do is help you forget you saw it at all. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your receipts in your pocket. You never know when you might need proof of a transaction you can't quite remember making.